Hello and welcome. I'm Erin from The Vegan Woman, and today I'm delighted to have the pleasure to interview our Vegan Woman Activist of the Month, Dr. Melanie Joy, social psychologist, activist, internationally acclaimed speaker, and author of 2 books, Why We Love Dogs, Eat Pigs, and Wear Cows, and Strategic Action for Animals. Dr. Joy is also the founder and president of Beyond Carnism, a charitable organization devoted to exposing and transforming the invisible belief system that conditions people to eat certain animals. If you're familiar with the word carnism, then you've already encountered Dr. Joy's incredible and enlightening work. Dr. Joy, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a real pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure for me too.
So first of all, could you tell our audience what your organization Beyond Carnism is and what exactly you do?
Sure. My organization, as you mentioned, is dedicated to exposing and transforming carnism, which is the invisible belief system or ideology that conditions people to eat certain animals. And we do this in a variety of ways. We have a Carnism Awareness International Speaking Tour that we've been running for 5 years. I've given my carnism presentation on 5 continents now, which is very exciting. We're developing a speaker training program so that we'll have more speakers giving the presentation. Right now, it's myself and 3 others. We are developing several video outreach campaigns. We run a project here in Berlin, Germany, where I live, called Carnismus Erkennen, which is dedicated to exposing and transforming carnism in German-speaking countries. And we're also developing a carnism flyer right now that is part of our international outreach as well. So we're putting together materials that can be translated and distributed worldwide. And we also conduct trainings for vegan activists and advocates around the world.
Wow, sounds amazing. So you're busy doing a lot of incredible work.
Yeah, we have a lot of other things in progress right now, but that's what we're actively working on at the moment.
Sounds great. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your own vegan journey and how you came into your work on carnism.
Sure. My own vegan journey started in 1989 when I was just 23 years old. So I'm 49 now, so that was more than half a lifetime ago at this point. I ate a hamburger that had been contaminated with a foodborne bacteria, and I wound up hospitalized. And I really just got turned off to eating meat after that. And so I became sort of an accidental vegetarian. And I was curious to learn about my new diet, my new lifestyle, which ultimately, of course, led me to information about animal agriculture. And what I learned shocked and horrified me. And of course, I had been a person who throughout my life who cared about animals. I cared about justice. I had a dog who I loved like a family member. And I also regularly ate meat, eggs, and dairy. So it was challenging for me to really reflect upon the fact that I had been actively participating in something that was so contradictory to my personal values. And, so I was just shocked by what I had learned about animal agriculture. And, but what was perhaps more shocking was that nobody I talked to wanted to hear about what I had to say. And so I became very curious about how rational, caring people like myself and those around me could just stop thinking and feeling when it comes to eating animals. So I became a vegetarian and then vegan shortly after that. And then I became very curious about the psychology of eating animals. The question that I was curious about was, how is it possible that so many of us can just remain blind to what's right in front of us?
And so from there, you've just taken off with your work?
Well, I ended up studying. I spent years really conducting research, and I wrote my doctoral dissertation on the psychology of eating meat. Okay. And that was what led me to discover what I came to call carnism.
Okay. I loved reading your work on carnism because it articulates so clearly something I've noticed since going vegan, which is our conditioning to eat meat and the lack of corresponding consideration that doing so is often an invisible choice. Could you explain more about carnism and outline the influence that it has on society?
Well, carnism is defined as the invisible belief system that conditions us to eat certain animals. It's essentially the opposite of veganism. Right? We tend to assume that only vegans and vegetarians have a belief system, but the only reason that many of us eat pigs but not dogs, for example, is because we do have a belief system when it comes to eating animals. When eating animals is not a necessity, then it's a choice. And choices always stem from beliefs. And today, for many people in the world, it is not necessary anymore to eat meat, eggs, or dairy. And carnism is, it's a dominant belief system. That means it's invisible. It's woven through the very structure of society to shape norms, laws, beliefs, behaviors, etc. And it also becomes internalized, shaping the very way we think and feel about eating animals. So, when we are born into a dominant system such as carnism, we inevitably look at the world through the lens of carnism. Mm-hmm. Now, carnism is also a violent system. Meat cannot be produced without killing, and egg and dairy production cause extensive harm to animals. And so carnism, like other violent ideologies, needs to use, or belief systems, needs to use defense mechanisms that really distort our thoughts and numb our feelings so that we act against our core values, values such as compassion and justice, without fully realizing what we're doing. In other words, carnism teaches us how not to think and feel. And this is how, well-intentioned people who care about animals and who care about justice, nonetheless participate in what is arguably a global atrocity, which is, carnism. Carnism, I'll say, I think today the statistic, it's always changing, but somewhere around 77 billion animals per year, farmed animals, and this is only land animals, are slaughtered for their flesh and other body parts. And this is a global statistic.
Right. And so you mentioned that we have defenses in order to keep carnism in place because it does run counter to our core values. So can you talk a little bit more about what these defenses are and how they operate?
Sure. One example of a defense is justification, right? We need to feel justified in eating animals. And the way that we learn to justify eating animals is by learning to believe that the myths of meat, eggs, and dairy are the facts of meat, eggs, and dairy. We learn to believe in what I refer to as the 3 N's of justification. Eating animals is normal, natural, and necessary. And of course, these same arguments have been used to justify violent practices throughout human history, such as slavery and male dominance and heterosexual supremacy. Another example of a defense is de-individualization, not seeing animals as individuals or farmed animals as individuals, just perceiving them as lacking any individuality or personality of their own. A pig is a pig, and all pigs are the same. Another example is seeing farmed animals as objects. So, we refer to them as livestock or something rather than someone. These defense mechanisms are distancing mechanisms. They psychologically and emotionally distance us from the violence of carnism so that we can feel comfortable enough to eat other sentient beings without, connecting with our natural empathy towards them.
Right. I find it really fascinating that there's so much that underlies something that most people don't even realize, the way that they're acting in their everyday lives through eating meat. And I wanted to ask you as well, since the majority of our audience is vegan, why do you think it's important for vegans to be aware of carnism and the defenses that go with it? And more specifically, what is neo-carnism and how does that relate to veganism?
Well, I'll explain those questions with 2 answers, 2 separate questions. And one that you asked is why vegans, why understanding carnism is important for vegans. There are a number of reasons for this. Very often vegans struggle with their own relationships with non-vegans or struggle to advocate to non-vegans to talk about this issue with people who are not vegans. Understanding carnism can help us to understand people can participate in harmful practices, and that doesn't make them bad people. When we understand how deeply rooted carnism is psychologically, And socially, we can appreciate that asking someone to stop eating animals is not simply asking for a change of behavior, but rather for a shift of consciousness. And that kind of shift doesn't happen until the person is ready for it to happen. So vegans often assume that the facts will sell the ideology. If only you knew the truth about eating animals, you'd never eat them again. More often than not, that's not the case. When we understand carnism, we can advocate more effectively. We can not expect the facts, the truth to make somebody change and go vegan overnight. That rarely happens. We can be more compassionate to those we reach out to. And we can recognize carnistic defenses so that we don't engage with them and kind of like fight this battle of justifications, for example. Also, recognizing carnism helps vegans to feel, or can help vegans to feel more grounded in and better able to articulate their own choices, ethical choices. And when we recognize carnism, this global atrocity, and the way that carnism is structured like other isms, like sexism and racism, we can appreciate that eating animals is not simply a matter of personal ethics, but it's rather the inevitable end result of a deeply entrenched oppressive system. So we can see eating animals as a social justice issue. And so vegans can feel more grounded in their choice to become vegan. Another reason that it's important to recognize carnism is because carnism impacts vegans as well as non-vegans. There are carnistic defenses that I refer to as secondary defenses. Carnism maintains itself in part by validating eating animals, teaching us that it's normal, natural, and necessary to eat animals, and also by invalidating not eating animals, by teaching us to, believe that veganism is unnatural, abnormal, unnecessary, that vegans are somehow wrong. So there are carnistic defenses that are structured to silence the vegan message. I call these secondary defenses. One example of a secondary defense is projection, kind of projecting onto vegans this image that makes us less likely to take seriously the vegan message. So vegans might be portrayed as, tofu-loving, tree-hugging hippies if we talk about compassion and peace. Or we might be portrayed as like militant, anti-human, activists if we talk about, express our anger at the atrocity that is carnism. There are a number of these secondary defenses that I believe are very important for vegans to recognize so that they're less likely to be impacted by them. And I've written an article about it called Speaking Truth to Power, and you may want to share that link with viewers so that they can have a look and get more information about it. Neo-carnism is a term that I use to describe like new forms of carnism that are emerging as the culture starts to change. I believe that thanks to the efforts of vegan activists and to just increased awareness of the damages and the danger of eating an animal-based diet, many people today are becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the idea of eating animals. And so these kind of new forms of carnism are emerging as justifications, new justifications for eating animals. And one of the forms of what I call neo-carnism is what I refer to as compassionate carnism, or, referred to sometimes as happy meat or humane meat. So there's this justification that's being instilled in the culture that, if we eat animals who were happy to be eaten, then, we're not really participating in harming animals. And this, of course, like all of the justifications, is a myth. When we think about, when we step outside of carnism, we can see how illogical this line of thinking, of argumentation actually is. So most of us, for example, would think it's cruel to kill a happy, healthy golden retriever just because people like the way her legs taste. And yet, when the exact same thing is done to individuals of other species, we're taught to think of that as humane or compassionate. So it's very important for us, I think, as vegans to continually examine, the arguments of the dominant culture and to be able to respond to them in a way that really highlights the illogical foundations of them. and of these, justifications, for example. And it's also important for us to recognize that, some of these kind of new forms of carnism are emerging because people do, in fact, care. People who buy so-called humane meat are doing that quite likely because they actually do want to do less harm to animals. And that's a good sign. It's a sign that people are examining their food choices and that they're choosing to do less harm. The problem is that it's not really less harm. If it is less harm, it's very significant. It's not very significantly less harm. So it's important for vegans to continue to promote our message of veganism, encouraging people to reduce their consumption of meat, eggs, and dairy and work toward veganism without just shifting the type of animals they're eating, for example, but also to appreciate that the choices that people make to try to do less harm are valid and are worth addressing in a way that really honors the fact that that people are trying to do the right thing.
Right, absolutely. That makes so much sense. Thank you for sharing that. And another important issue you talked about and written about is secondary traumatic stress. So can you explain to our audience what this is and how it affects us as vegans and why it's important for us to know about it?
Sure. Secondary traumatic stress, or sometimes secondary traumatic stress disorder, if it becomes problematic for a person, it's STSD, is like PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. The symptoms are the same. The only difference is that STSD impacts those who are witnesses to violence rather than those who are the direct victims of violence. For many vegans who have, seen the truth of what's really happening to animals in this world, vegans who simply have to walk through this world where, daily we're essentially exposed to body parts. We can become traumatized by this imagery, by this reality, by, the reality that we live in a world where people are putting dead animals' bodies into their mouths and thinking that nothing is wrong with that and that something is wrong with us for being upset by it. Now, of course, it makes sense. When you understand carnism, you understand how all of this is possible. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, it's important for us to recognize that it does have an impact, that living in this world where we are, consistently witnessing either violence or the results of violence can take a psychological toll on us, particularly for vegans who are activists as well. And who are, exposed to the horrors of animal agriculture in an ongoing way. So it's when we recognize secondary traumatic stress, we're able to attend to it. We're able to develop resiliency in ourselves so that we're less likely to develop a disorder, to become compromised by it, and so that we can prevent ourselves from becoming traumatized in the future or further traumatized in the future. I actually have a talk on sustainability that's online now that addresses this to some degree. And I always recommend a book called Trauma Stewardship, which was written for activists in order to prevent and treat secondary traumatic stress.
Okay, thank you. That may be useful to a lot of our readers and viewers who may not even be aware that such a thing actually exists. So it's good information to know. And before we wrap things up, I'd like to ask you one more thing. So is there a message that you'd like to leave the Vegan Woman audience with?
Yes, as I said earlier in our conversation, I've given my carnism presentation. I think I mentioned this, but I've been on an international speaking tour for 5 years, and I've given my presentation on 5 continents now. And what I have noticed most in my experience is not the differences among cultures when it comes to eating animals, but the similarities. And the core similarity is that people care. Everywhere I go, people care. They care about animals. They care about justice. They care about the truth. And they genuinely want to be a part of the solution. And everywhere I go, I see evidence that the vegan movement is not only growing, but is thriving. It's mushrooming. And when we understand the psychology of isms like carnism, and we understand the way that isms unfold over history, the course of history, when people of conscience realize what's going on, when it becomes increasingly possible for people to change their behaviors and attitudes, people do change. And there is, the evidence strongly suggests that veganism will one day replace carnism as the dominant ideology. In my mind, the question is not whether, but when. And so I think we have, I strongly believe that as vegans, we have a lot of reason to be very, very hopeful.
That's great. Yeah, we really do. So thank you so much for joining us today. It's been really an honor and a pleasure to speak with you and to listen to all of your wisdom. And I'm sure it will be very helpful to our viewers as well.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.
So thanks for tuning in, everyone. If you'd like to learn more about Dr. Joy's organization Beyond Carnism or read more about her work, please visit our website at theveganwoman.com for the feature article. Thanks so much and have a great day. Look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye.